ブルブルブルブル。寒いと服を着て、寒かったら服を着て。Which is correct? 寒い。We are learning all Japanese conditional particles in one video. 何それ? So conditionals. In English, conditionals are expressed in a sentence using if, talking about hypothetical situations. And in Japanese, basically 4 kinds of particles, と、たら、ば、なら are used to express conditionals. Each has a different feature and is used in different situations. So we are explaining a feature of each particle and help you to pick an appropriate one depending on situations. First of all, we learn basic sentence structure. Every conditional particle connects 2 parts, the conditional clause and the outcome clause. The conditional clause, the particle, the outcome clause. The conditional clause, the particle, the outcome clause. All conditional sentences have the same structure. Then let's move on to the first conditional particle, と. The particle と expresses general facts or things that always happen. Once the condition is met, consequence in the outcome clause always happens. 春になると花が咲く. If spring comes, flowers bloom. Once the condition is met, the consequence always happens. The particle と is often used to explain how to use a machine. It makes sense because machines are good at doing tasks repeatedly. ここにお金を入れると切符が出てくる. If you put money here, a ticket comes out. Also, you can express your habit with the particle と. 朝起きると水を飲む. When I wake up in the morning, I drink water. And one thing you need to know is the particle と cannot be used to express your wish, will, request in the outcome part because your wish or request is based on every situation, not on a habit. ちょっと難しいよ. Also, と can describe sequence of actions in the past. For example, スーパーに行くとセールをしていた. と can express the situation in the past where one thing leads to the next. Sentence construction. To make a sentence with the particle と place a dictionary form of verb before と. Next up, たら. たら is used to talk about more specific situations than と. 暇になったら教えて. Let me know when you are free. With たら, conditional clauses can cover both hypothetical and definite situations. 晴れたら海に行きたい. 晴れ is a hypothetical situation. Another example. 昼になったら出かける. It is definite that it will be noon. Tara likes to talk about what-if story and can express your wish, will, or request in the outcome part. 空を飛べたら世界一周したい. This is describing your wish. 家に帰ったらゲームをしてもいい? This is describing your request. Additionally, Tara can describe a sequence of actions in the past like the particle と do. スーパーに行くとセールをしていた. Swap the particle と with Tara. スーパーに行ったらセールをしていた. Both mean the same thing and have the same nuances. One thing you need to know is that Tara is number 1 at expressing hypothetical situations. Tara is versatile and exchangeable with the other conditional particles in most cases, although it's not always the best choice. Sentence construction. To make a sentence with たら place た form of verb before ら。Now remember these sentences. 寒いと服を着て、寒かったら服を着て。Which do you think is correct? The one with たら is correct. The particle たら can express a request, but と cannot. Let's move on to the particle ば。ば shares some similarities with both と and たら。Like と、ば can express general facts or repeatable things. For example, ここにお金を入れれば、切符が出てくる。Like たら、but can also express hypothetical situations. 晴れれば海に行きます。The unique feature of ば is that it emphasizes the condition as a means to achieve your goal. セールに行けば服が安く買える。In this sentence, you are focusing on going to a sale to get clothes at lower price. どうすればいいですか? Furthermore, ば is used to ask an advice. どうすれば日本語が上手になりますか? As we mentioned, ば emphasizes the conditional part to achieve the desired outcome. So the outcome part expresses typically a desirable event. Additionally, wishes or requests are generally not expressed in the outcome part, unless the condition describes the state. 質問があれば、いつでも聞いてください。The verb ある is used to express states. Sentence construction. In Japanese, verbs have a conditional form. While と、たら and なら can express conditionals without using this form, but requires it. This makes ば the most basic conditional expression. Let's take a look at how to form the conditional form, starting with group 1 verbs. When creating the conditional form with group 1 verbs, start with the mass form of the verb. Then drop the mass ending. Next, remove the final E vowel sound from the root of mass form and add E vowel sound to it. Adding ば at the end completes the conditional clause. これを読めばわかります。Moving on to the group 2 verbs. For group 2 verbs, you replace the mass ending with れば。おいしいものを食べれば幸せになる。Remove mass and add れば。And for group 3 verbs, 来る becomes 来れば and する becomes すれば。To make a negative conditional sentence, you replace the negative verb ない with なければ。行かない becomes 行かなければ。Here's how it works for other parts of speech. For E adjective, delete E and add ければ。For な adjective, delete な and add なら。As for nouns, add なら。わー、あとちょっと。頑張って。なら。The characteristic of なら is different from と、たら and ば。なら conveys advice or request based on the last conversation. In a sentence with なら, the last conversation is expressed as a premise, and advice or request is expressed in the outcome clause.
今度、東京に行くんだ。
いいなぁ。東京に行くなら浅草がおすすめだよ。東京に行くなら浅草がおすすめです。The last conversation about visiting Tokyo is expressed as a premise, and the recommendation is followed. Also, Nara can express your assumption.
じ
コンビニに行くならコーラを買ってきて。There was no previous conversation, but Peppy made an assumption by the appearance of Moon-chan. So the point is that Nara doesn't express a relationship between conditions and outcomes like other particles do. Nara just tell advice or request based on a premise. Sentence construction. To make a sentence with the particle Nara, place a dictionary form of verb before Nara. Sometimes no or is placed before Nara, but it doesn't change the meaning. 見てくれてありがとう! If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to hit subscribe. またね! If you'd like to learn more Japanese grammar, check the left one. And if you'd like to learn Japanese kanji, check the right one. Bye!